Captain Gareth Stevens was known across Earth's far-flung colonies as a seasoned leader, as indomitable as the cold metal hulls of the starships he commanded. A career spent patrolling the volatile border between human and alien territory had carved deep lines into his face and honed his instincts to a razor's edge. Yet nothing, no battle or standoff, had ever instilled such pride in him as his only son, Lucas. Lucas Stevens was the bright promise of a peaceful future. Freshly graduated from the Galactic Academy, the young man carried his father's resolve but wore it with the optimism of youth. Where Gareth was hardened and vigilant, Lucas was open-hearted and driven, eager to bridge the growing tensions between humanity and the alien Zyrixians. His latest mission, a diplomatic envoy to a Zyrixian-controlled sector, was meant to be the start of something new, a chance for peace. And with a father's pride and trepidation, Gareth had watched him go. The message arrived when Gareth was aboard the Heroic, his command ship, reviewing tactical reports. The words on his datapad were cold and clinical, yet each one burned like acid. Envoy Lucas Stevens deceased. Attack by Zyrixian operatives confirmed. Gareth stared at the screen, his mind struggling to reconcile the brutal finality of it. His son's life, the single connection that had sustained him through countless battles, was gone, extinguished in a moment of calculated violence. Anguish roared through him, tearing at the disciplined armor he'd worn for decades. He reread the report in numb disbelief, each line punctuating his helplessness. Lucas hadn't died in a skirmish or an accident. He'd been targeted, assassinated. In the next communiqué, an encoded report offered what little information the analysts had pieced together. Lucas had been killed by a faction of Zyrixians led by General Krovak, a ruthless alien commander notorious for his disdain of humans. "Why him?" he whispered into the silence, his voice as hollow as he felt. The message continued with impersonal efficiency, detailing Lucas's last moments. There had been no chance of survival. The attack was swift, merciless. The Zyrixians had not simply sought to silence a diplomat. They had struck at the heart of their strongest adversary. Gareth knew, even as he read, that this wasn't about Lucas. It was a calculated attempt to destroy Gareth himself. The Zyrixians had known precisely what Lucas's death would mean. He felt a black, burning hatred rise in his chest. Memories of Lucas, vivid and relentless, flickered before him. Lucas smiling in his academy uniform, Lucas eagerly describing his ambitions, Lucas assuring him that he'd be careful, that he'd be back. Gareth clenched his fists, knuckles whitening, as an insatiable need for retribution filled the hollow space in his chest. The following day, a meeting with his superiors brought nothing but platitudes. They insisted on diplomacy, on careful navigation of this complex situation. But their words did nothing to quell his rage. They would not pursue justice. To them, Lucas was a necessary casualty in an already precarious peace. The Zyrixians had killed his son with impunity, and no one would be held accountable. He realized, with a cold certainty, that if justice was to be served, it would be by his own hand. A burning clarity settled over him. The thought of vengeance was not born from a moment of weakness. It crystallized in the silent conviction that this wrong could not go unanswered. He would do what needed to be done. He would hunt them down, the operatives who had ambushed Lucas, the ones who had stood by, and ultimately, General Krovak. They would pay, each one, and he would make sure they knew why. Ignoring orders and protocol, Gareth stripped himself of his rank and insignia, a final, silent act of defiance. He no longer served under the Galactic Command. His allegiance was now to a single cause. He armed himself, selected a spacecraft built for speed and stealth, and left the ship he'd commanded for years. It felt like shedding an old skin, stepping away from everything he had once been. The last words he spoke to his crew were curt, but they carried a depth that needed no further explanation. "I'm going alone. I don't expect you to understand," he told them, voice stripped of all warmth. They watched in respectful silence, recognizing the raw determination in his eyes, a force more terrifying than any weapon. In the solitude of space, the image of Lucas haunted him. But instead of filling him with sorrow, it ignited a deadly resolve. He would leave his mark, a clear message to every Zyrixian involved in Lucas's murder. One by one, he would eliminate each of them, leaving behind the same terror and despair they had unleashed on him. As he engaged the ship's engines, Gareth's thoughts fixed on Krovak, the alien general who had orchestrated it all. This was no longer about peace treaties or interstellar politics. For each Zyrixian who had taken part in this, retribution awaited. And when he finally reached Krovak, Gareth would ensure his final act of revenge would serve as a warning: humanity was not so easily broken. Without a backward glance, Gareth set his course toward the heart of Zyrixian territory. The captain was gone. What remained was a father, consumed with vengeance, prepared to walk alone into the darkness of space, carrying with him the certainty of retribution. John Stevens's descent into Zyrixian space was as silent as a predator's breath. His vessel, the Vigilant, was a sleek, nimble craft designed for infiltration, an appropriate weapon for the mission that had now consumed him. Armed with advanced stealth technology and a small cache of high-intensity plasma weaponry, he moved undetected, his focus singular, his heart hardened. He had obtained a list of names through both official channels and contacts in the underworld who owed him favors from decades past. It was a short list, but every name on it had a direct hand in the murder of his son. First on that list was Draxa, a mid-level operative who had executed the ambush under General Krovak's orders. Draxa had been reported hiding on a desolate asteroid outpost, a refuge known to host some of the galaxy's most violent mercenaries. For Stevens, it was a perfect place to begin. The approach to the outpost was fraught with anticipation. Gareth scanned the barren rock as the Vigilant hovered silently, casting shadows across the pockmarked landscape. There, nestled against the cliffside, was the entrance to Draxa's hideout, a cave barely discernible among the jagged rocks. He knew from years of battle experience that the advantage of surprise would be fleeting. He had seconds, no more. The hatch hissed open, and he disembarked, his footsteps silent on the gravelly surface. His pulse was steady, each beat a metronome guiding him closer to his target. Draxa was alone, just as the intel had promised. Inside, the atmosphere reeked of decay and neglect, the dim glow of alien tech casting a sickly hue across the cramped space. Draxa was there, his reptilian eyes narrowing in surprise before he reached for a weapon. "You'll want to think twice about that," Gareth growled, his voice low and deadly. The plasma blaster in his hand was raised, aimed with a precision that left no room for negotiation. Draxa's hand froze midair, his confidence dissolving under the force of Stevens's gaze. "You don't belong here, human," Draxa hissed, his voice laced with forced bravado. "You think killing me will change anything?" John's jaw clenched, the fury within him barely contained. "This isn't about change, Draxa. This is about justice. For Lucas Stevens." Recognition flickered in Draxa's eyes, followed quickly by fear. Gareth stepped forward unyielding, his eyes cold as he studied the alien before him. "Tell me what Krovak feared so much that he ordered the death of my son." Draxa's sneer faltered, and his eyes darted to the exit. But Gareth's blaster held him in place. "You're too late. Krovak's already tightening his defenses. He'll know you're coming." Draxa spat, his tone wavering. A bitter smile touched Gareth's lips. "Good. Let him feel what it's like to wait, knowing death is coming." Without another word, Gareth fired, ending Draxa's life in an instant. The death was swift but definitive, a message in itself, one that Krovak would soon understand. Stepping over the body, Gareth left the cave, his thoughts already on the next target. Each assassination honed his focus, and with each kill, he felt himself slipping further from the man he'd once been. His memories of Lucas, once filled with warmth and pride, had twisted into jagged reminders of his loss. Each target was a grim step on a path he could no longer turn back from. Days later, he tracked down the second name on his list, Yorzer, another of Krovak's operatives, holed up in the labyrinthine corridors of an abandoned freighter in neutral space. Unlike Draxa, Yorzer was prepared, flanked by mercenaries hired to guard against threats exactly like this. But Gareth was prepared too, his anger now a finely sharpened weapon. With stealth and precision, he bypassed security checkpoints, disabling alarms and cameras as he went. Yorzer was holed up in a large, dimly lit cargo hold, flanked by guards armed with plasma rifles. Gareth positioned himself behind a stack of crates, studying their movements, every second a calculation. The attack was swift and brutal. Plasma shots echoed through the hold as he cut down each guard, his training and experience overwhelming their disorganized defenses. The last guard fell, and Gareth advanced on Yorzer, who was cornered, his hands raised in a futile attempt to shield himself. "Mercy!" Yorzer pleaded, desperation breaking through his hardened demeanor. "Did you show mercy to my son?" Gareth's voice was ice, devoid of pity. Yorzer shook his head, mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words, to save his own life. But Gareth's resolve was unbreakable. With a final, unflinching shot, he ended Yorzer's life, leaving the freighter as silently as he had arrived. Back aboard the Vigilant, Gareth reviewed the list, his next target flashing on the screen. Each name brought him closer to Krovak, each life he took a step nearer to the ultimate reckoning. He knew word of his actions was spreading. Alien communication channels were abuzz with rumors of a rogue human captain, an unrelenting specter hunting down Krovak's men. He wanted them to feel that fear, to know that he was coming. But even as he closed in on his enemies, Gareth couldn't shake the hollow ache that gnawed at him, a silent reminder that vengeance was not the same as peace. The journey had changed him, made him sharper, colder. He was no longer a captain bound by duty, but a man driven by something far darker and more consuming. He set the coordinates for the next target, and watched the stars blur into motion, feeling Lucas's presence as a quiet, unyielding force. The path of revenge was far from over, and Gareth Stevens had committed himself fully to seeing it through. The news of Captain Gareth Stevens's ruthless vendetta spread like wildfire through Zyrixian ranks. Alien commanders traded frantic transmissions, recounting tales of fallen operatives and chilling messages left in their wake, each marking the path of a solitary human who seemed more like a force of nature than flesh and blood. The Zyrixian command was thrown into a maelstrom of fear and disarray, and at the eye of this storm was General Krovak himself. In the grand halls of a Zyrixian stronghold, Krovak held a tense briefing, his crimson scales dull under the chamber's cold blue lights. Around him stood his top advisors, their once confident postures now taut with unease. As Krovak reviewed the recent deaths of Draxa and Yorzer, his jaw clenched, the pressure evident in every tense movement. "This Stevens," Krovak hissed, his voice a menacing rumble that resonated through the chamber. "He is but one human, yet he has managed to sow fear throughout our forces. Are we now so weak that a single man makes us cower?" One of his lieutenants, Narek, shifted nervously. "General, he's not merely a man, he is a highly trained operative. Stevens has the skill and experience of a seasoned captain, and he is relentless. His methods have been unpredictable." "Then make them predictable," Krovak snarled, his claws digging into the armrest of his chair. "We underestimated him. He hunts like a Zyrixian assassin, patient, precise. He's dismantling our ranks with a vengeance." "Reports indicate he's moving closer, General," added another advisor, her voice subdued. "Stevens is following the chain of command that led to his son's death, and he's leaving us no time to regroup. Morale is faltering." Krovak's eyes narrowed, and his claws drummed impatiently on the table. He understood the delicate balance of power within their hierarchy. Showing fear or vulnerability was as dangerous as the human himself. But there was an undeniable truth in what his advisors feared. Stevens was eroding their authority, one assassination at a time. To the Zyrixian forces, Stevens had become a specter, a creature born of hatred who could not be bargained with or subdued. Krovak took a slow, measured breath, reining in his frustration. "Then let us send a message of our own. We will turn Stevens's hunt against him." He looked to his lieutenants, his voice taking on a cold, predatory calm. "Inform every Zyrixian operative that they are to remain armed and vigilant at all times. Stevens must be treated as the apex threat. We will drive him into a corner, outnumber him, and end this madness. Meanwhile, across the border, the Galactic Command was receiving its own flood of intelligence reports. The Zyrixians had issued a rare diplomatic communique, demanding that human authorities rein in their rogue operative or face repercussions. They declared Stevens's actions as an outright violation of peace protocols, warning that his vendetta threatened to plunge the region into open war. But Stevens's former superiors knew that the captain was beyond their reach, that nothing they could say would halt his vengeful course. Human diplomats scrambled to contain the fallout, offering empty reassurances to the Zyrixians and ordering surveillance across human colonies. Yet those closest to Gareth, his former crew and confidants, knew that Stevens would not stop until Krovak's blood marked the final chapter of his revenge. The diplomatic situation deteriorated, tensions mounting with each new report of a Zyrixian official found dead, another name on Stevens's dwindling list. In the solitude of his ship, Stevens prepared for his next encounter, fully aware of the rippling consequences. Every kill sent waves through the ranks, chipping away at Zyrixian stability, but also heightening their collective resolve against him. He could almost feel their response, like a tightening noose. It didn't matter. The path was set, and he was ready to see it through to the bitter end. His thoughts were interrupted by a transmission intercepted from the Zyrixian communication channels. It was a short, coded message addressed to Krovak himself. Human approaching. Preparation complete. Will eliminate at next point of contact. Stevens's lips twisted into a grim smile. The Zyrixians were preparing their own trap. Good, he thought. He wanted them to be ready, to know he was coming. This wasn't about victory or survival. This was retribution, pure and undiluted. And if they intended to fight back, he would make certain they remembered the price of taking his son. In their stronghold, Krovak and his commanders finalized their preparations, determined to end Stevens's rampage before it further undermined their authority. The general's orders were explicit. Stevens was to be taken dead, his body displayed as proof of Zyrixian dominance. To that end, Krovak had stationed elite forces at every conceivable point of entry, establishing an inescapable perimeter. But as night fell over the stronghold, unease gnawed at the troops stationed in the shadowed corridors and watchtowers. Every corner seemed to echo with imagined footsteps, each shadow an omen of death. They whispered of the captain who fought without mercy, who struck like lightning and vanished before they could mount a defense. Stevens's legend grew with each death, a myth that walked among them, instilling fear like an infection. In his private quarters, Krovak wrestled with the reality that his plan to rid the Zyrixians of a threat had become a vulnerability. He had underestimated the strength of a father's fury, had miscalculated the price Stevens was willing to pay. And now, with each passing day, the question gnawed at him: would Stevens finally fall into their trap, or would the human captain succeed in reaching him, even here, at the heart of Zyrixian power? The stronghold was silent, its lights dimmed in anticipation of Stevens's approach. Guards stood at their posts, weapons at the ready, as the alien fortress seemed to breathe in collective anticipation. Yet despite their preparations, Krovak couldn't shake a lingering sense of foreboding. Stevens was coming, and there was no certainty in what lay ahead. For the first time, Krovak felt the same dread his operatives must have felt, an unshakable belief that perhaps, despite all efforts to contain him, Captain Gareth Stevens would not be stopped. John Stevens moved through the heart of the Zyrixian stronghold with a chilling calm, a lethal shadow against the alien architecture. Every sense was on high alert, absorbing the faint hum of machinery, the low murmurs of Zyrixian guards unaware of his proximity. He had reached the final stretch of his mission, and the energy thrumming through him was not that of triumph but of singular, sharpened purpose. General Krovak waited in the central chamber, a mere dozen meters and a few elite guards away. His heart beat with steady resolve as he descended a narrow corridor toward the command center, its thick, reinforced doors guarded by 4 of Krovak's best soldiers. Stevens moved soundlessly, assessing each movement, each flicker of the dim blue lights that cast eerie shadows across the walls. The years of experience guided his hand. With swift, precise shots from his plasma blaster, he dispatched each guard in moments, their bodies crumpling to the floor in silence. He stepped over them, the weight of their deaths a distant echo compared to the ache that filled his chest. Nothing but Krovok's blood would satisfy the hollow ache his son's murder had left. In his mind, he saw Lucas, vibrant and eager, alive with dreams and hope, a memory so potent it nearly halted him in his tracks. But vengeance beckoned, pulling him forward. With a single, forceful shove, he opened the reinforced doors to the command chamber. The space was vast, its high ceilings adorned with alien banners, blue and black. There, waiting in the center, was Krovok, his crimson scales glinting beneath the chamber's stark lighting. The general turned to face him, a predatory glint in his eyes. "So you've come at last," Krovok said, his voice a low, rasping growl. He straightened, his large, muscular frame tense yet confident. He wore his military insignia proudly, a reminder of his rank, his power, a defiance to Stevens's presence. Stevens stepped forward, each stride deliberate, controlled. "You ordered the death of my son," he said, his voice a deadly calm that belied the fury within. "You took Lucas from me, thinking it would make me weak. You thought wrong." Krovok smirked, baring sharp teeth. "The boy was a pawn, a tool to destabilize you. But here you are, one human against the strength of the Zyrixian Empire. Your loss is inconsequential, and your vengeance is a fool's errand. Then let's finish this," Stevens replied, holstering his plasma blaster and drawing a combat knife. If this was to be his final act, he would face Krovok with the primal ferocity that had carried him through the bloodshed. Krovok's smirk faded, and he squared his stance, his own blade, a long, jagged weapon forged of dark Zyrixian steel, glinting in his hand. He lunged forward, his strength evident in the force of his blows. Stevens sidestepped, dodging the blade's deadly arc, his movements precise and controlled. He countered with a sharp swipe of his knife, the blade grazing Krovok's arm, leaving a deep, bloody gash. Krovok hissed, a fierce glint of anger sparking in his eyes. He pressed the attack with renewed vigor, each swing of his weapon designed to overpower, to break Stevens. But Gareth was relentless, fueled by an inner resolve far stronger than physical endurance. He moved fluidly, deflecting Krovok's attacks, every blow and counter a testament to his years of combat experience. With a brutal swing, Krovok managed to slice across Stevens's shoulder, sending a jolt of pain radiating through him. Stevens gritted his teeth, refusing to falter. Pain was fleeting, insignificant compared to his purpose. He parried the next strike, slipping past Krovok's defenses to land a vicious slash across his chest, drawing dark alien blood that spattered against the floor. Krovok staggered, the realization of his own vulnerability dawning on him. His confidence faltered, and Stevens seized the moment, pressing the advantage. With a final surge, he drove his blade into Krovok's side, twisting it with a savage precision that elicited a guttural roar from the alien general. Krovok fell to one knee, clutching the wound, his face twisted in agony. "You were wrong about humans," Stevens said, his voice low, yet filled with a cold satisfaction. "We don't break easily." Krovok's eyes, once fierce, were now clouded with fear, a desperation he had never shown in his life. He struggled to speak, but his strength was ebbing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The mighty general, who had once orchestrated the death of Gareth's son with calculated indifference, now faced the weight of his own mortality. Stevens crouched down, meeting Krovok's gaze, his voice a venomous whisper. "This is for Lucas," he said, pressing his blade deeper until Krovok's final, rattling breath escaped him. Silence fell over the chamber, a stillness that was both liberating and empty. Stevens withdrew his knife, rising to his feet. The deed was done. The revenge he had so meticulously hunted, so ruthlessly exacted, now lay at his feet, his son's killer defeated. He took a deep, unsteady breath, the realization settling over him. The vengeance that had driven him, that had consumed every fiber of his being, was over. Yet as he looked down at Krovok's lifeless body, a hollow ache remained, one that vengeance could not fill. Slowly, Gareth turned and left the chamber, his footsteps echoing through the silent hall. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet resolve as he walked away from the shadows of his past, into a future he would have to rebuild from the fragments left behind.